an existential threat to the Palestinian national project. It's not the only existential threat, but it is one. And that's what makes it unique and certainly not a peace process. If the goal of a peace process should be to reconcile competing claims, not to completely negate one of them. It's not at all clear that Mahmoud Abbas's leadership has a strategy for confronting this very serious challenge, other than registering opposition in various international forums. We saw the Arab League issue a fairly strong statement. We saw a similar statement from the Organization of the Islamic Conference, and now attempts at the United Nations to get more condemnation. And the other aspect of that Mahmoud Abbas of his non-strategy is essentially to wait the Trump administration out. But beyond that, I don't think he has a clear plan. The last thing I want to say is we, as bad as things are and as absurd as this administration is going about this, we shouldn't forget how we got here. The Trump administration this plan didn't emerge in a vacuum. All of the three goals, really, the path had been laid by previous administrations. So we saw, in terms of eroding the rules of the peace process, we saw Clinton do it, we saw Bush do it. They were constantly eroding the land for peace formula. You know, we don't like settlements, but go ahead and build anyway in the places that are high priority for you in Israel. We saw all these loopholes and this constant undercutting of the basic rules of the process. We also saw Palestinian leaders being delegitimized. We all remember the no partner narrative. Palestinians are not a partner after Camp David and at various moments during the 2000s. And so again, this is not a new phenomenon. It is really kind of the culmination of the old approach more than it is a new approach. And we also saw how past presidents tried to prejudice the outcome of negotiations, maybe not quite as egregiously and brazenly as this administration has. But if we recall back to President George W. Bush's letter of assurances to Ariel Sharon, in which he laid out, again, a unilaterally determined outcome on refugees, on Jerusalem, on settlements, and so forth, that was negotiated between the Israelis and the Americans without Palestinian input. So there's precedent for everything that Trump is doing. He's just simply doing it in its most extreme form.
Thank you very much for your initial remarks. Let's hear Mr. Perez's initial remarks then.
Thank you. There are plenty of people in Washington who give you a detailed critique of the Kushner plan. I'm not going to do that. Rather, I'm going to issue some kind of general observations that'll tell you a little bit about my own journey to try to understand, my intellectual journey, try to understand what's going on here. What's truly happening. And as I prepared for my remarks today, I was pulled back to kind of my intellectual foundations and the intellectual foundations of plenty of people in America, to Hannah Arendt, and to kind of rereading Arendt's sometimes very controversial views about Zionism. And I would recommend to you, if you haven't read it, to read her 1944 essay, Zionism Reconsidered, in which she offered kind of an outlook on Zionism that was at odds with the celebration of it by European Jews and those in the Zionist project who wanted to found an Israeli state, which she was eventually very skeptical of. And one of the kind of pillars of Hannah Arendt's thinking was on what happened in the 20th century in totalitarianism, the rise of Soviet totalitarianism and German totalitarianism, and her, I think, real perception is included in a statement attributed to her, in which she wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she said that the one thing that you must do if you are to oppress a people first is to make them stateless. That is to say, the most fundamental right is not life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The most fundamental right is that people actually have rights, that human beings are the kinds of entities that have and are attributed to them rights. So if you strip away statehood, if you make a person stateless, the law doesn't apply to them. And if the law doesn't apply to them, then you can treat them any way that you want. And I noticed in the Kushner plan, page 13 of the Kushner plan, which lays out a program for future negotiations that will lead to a Palestinian state, and the statehood is rarely mentioned in the plan, that the plan not only makes the Palestinians stateless, it makes them invisible. But one of the salient features of the Kushner plan is this program for Palestinian entities in the West Bank linked to Gaza, where these Bantustans or Palestinian Authority is linked by bridges and tunnels. And there are rather illustrative and interesting illustrations of how this would work so that Palestinian lands would be linked together, but they would also be separate from the Israeli state. And it struck me as, it's not the first time we've heard it, but it struck me as, just so obviously un-American, probably not the right word, but and I tried to grab onto kind of an analogy for this. And the analogy that I came up with is there are 9 Native American reservations, American Indian reservations in South Dakota, Standing Rock, Yankton. And if we were to link them all together, they're quite separate. If we were to link them all together by bridges and tunnels, we would have an American metaphor for what the Kushner plan lays out for the Palestinians. So we not only render our American or our Native American population stateless, we would render them invisible. And that is the intention of the Kushner plan. Israelis don't want to see the Palestinians. They not only don't want to have them have a state, they don't want to see them. It struck me as perverse that Americans, otherwise I think many people disagree with this, Americans otherwise who speak highly of their ideals would be even proposing such a solution. That, a nation like ours founded to put people together of different backgrounds, ethnic identities, and religions would be proposing to our major ally in the Middle East that they don't need to be a society like ours, but can establish a society that is totally separate and that would not see where they're living is astonishing to me. So that's my first observation, is that the United States of America is proposing a plan that is absolutely un-American, and from which most Americans, I think, if they were to spend the time reading the plan, not many Americans do, would recoil. The second thing that kind of occurred to me was, apart from the plan, is the way that the plan was rolled out. And that is that there was a ceremony in the East Room of the White House, I believe, in which those who weren't in attendance were as prominent as those in attendance. So you had up in the upper right-hand corner of the room donors to the Trump campaign, including Jewish donors who were quite right-wing and supporters of the Netanyahu settlement government in Israel. You had Republicans, very conservative, and then very prominently in that room, evangelical Christians. Those were the 3 major groups that were represented. Of course, the Palestinians were nowhere to be seen, but that to me just confirmed my previous point, my hunch that the goal of the program is to make Palestinians not only stateless, but invisible. And they were certainly invisible during the rollout. Well, also what struck me is not only were the Palestinians not there, but that the Jewish American community, the progressive Jewish American community, is primarily a progressive community. Jewish Americans have supported the civil rights movement, funded the civil rights movement, gave their lives in the civil rights movement, vote Democratic, view themselves as progressive. They weren't there. So that the optics for the plan seem to confirm what we've always known about the Trump administration, that it is not simply very conservative, but ultra-conservative, and that it is primarily dependent for its support on evangelical Christians. That is particularly true of the Kushner plan, which is an expression of evangelicals' views of Israel. That is my second observation. My third observation is that taking all of this, my first 2 points, into view, I think that the Kushner plan is profoundly important and significant for American foreign policy to this degree. It reflects more than promotes, but it reflects what I think is becoming an increasing obvious reality. That the conflict in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians has been transformed. I don't say this tentatively, I'm convinced of it, but I don't think that many other people will be convinced of it. The conflict that we're seeing that is now emerging, that the Kushner plan confirms, the conflict is no longer between Israelis and Palestinians. The primary conflict is between Israelis and American Jews. That's what I think is really going on here, is that the Jewish community in the United States will, I think, majoritarian by a large proportion, is now finding itself to be different than the Israeli Jewish community, which American progressive Jews view as as imperialistic and racially based, and that American Jews in large numbers as a result of this are turning away from their previous loyalty to Israel and are making decisions that will have a significant impact on the American political environment. We've noticed that Mr. Trump has said explicitly, December 19th, this last year, that in order to be a patriotic American, you have to be a patriotic Israeli. That people who don't like Israel are not really patriotic Americans. In 1944, Hannah Arendt said the same thing, that the creation of Israel would present a very significant and profound, would have a very significant, profound impact on American Jews, who would become disaffected with an Israel that is dependent for its support, not on its neighbors who are Arabs, but on the United States. And that Israel would be looked at by its Arab neighbors as an expression of American imperialism. Secondarily, and perhaps more crucially, that, as Hannah Arendt would say, American progressives would become disaffected from a state that was founded on a purely racial basis. And because it was founded on a purely racial basis, American Jews would recoil from the view that Israel is the New Jerusalem, that it is a light unto the peoples of the world, that it is the hope for the future, that it's the homeland for the Jews, and that American Jews would come to realize that the real hope for Judaism in the world, a place where Jews can go where they're safe, is not Israel, but the United States of America. We're the New Jerusalem. We're the city on the hill. We're the place where people can come together and practice their religion free from fetters and oppression. I think that's what's happening with the Kushner plan. And I think that's what's going on inside the Jewish community in the United States. I'll say one more thing, and then I'll kind of leave it. This has already gotten me in trouble enough, probably. We're seeing reactions inside the Jewish community to the emergence of these issues. I read and reread and read again Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. And I read every day in the Jewish press these concern over rise of anti-Semitism. And I worry about the conflation of anti-Semitism with the BDS campaign. That people who are anti-Israeli are now being viewed as anti-Semites. So it's an astonishingly negative trend in our political life that this is happening. But if BDS is anti-Semitism, and if terrorism isn't allowed, and if conflicts are to be avoided, and Palestinians must be disarmed, what tool is left for the Palestinians to use to gain their rights and their statehoods to become visible again? This is a tough time. I don't think the Kushner plan is going to go anywhere, but I think the debate inside the Jewish community and the conflict that we see there will go somewhere. Its impact yet to be seen. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry. It's really great to see the deep of the problem, and it's also interesting to see that the root of the problem goes back to Hannah Arendt's expressions and works, discussions, ideas. So I'd like to turn to Mr. Ustun, specifically about his remarks on Turkey's position in this deal.
Thank you, Hasan. Before talking about Turkey, I want to offer a couple of observations on the plan. The plan, obviously, it's interesting in the way that it was announced, and everybody, I think, at least me, I expected Israel's security to be the number one priority pervading the entire plan. Whatever was going to be announced, it was going to be about Israel's security. And we see that in the plan, whether they're talking about any kind of sovereignty for the Palestinians, economic development plans, etc., independent, the state that the Palestinians are supposed to one day, hopefully, maybe at the end, somehow get, is still subject to Israel's security needs. So we are not surprised about that. At least I'm not surprised about that. But the interesting thing is Trump's plan actually kind of, we all knew there's been a lot of discussions about how the U.S. was not a neutral party, and there was a lot of debate. And various administrations, like my co-panelists mentioned, tried based on certain principles. But if you want to be really cynic about it, it was just not going to happen. The administrations underhandedly, perhaps not as openly, prioritized Israel's security. The difference with Trump is he's basically saying that's the only thing we care about, and Palestinians, you lost, and just move on. And here is what we're willing to give you, take it or leave it. They don't actually, I mean, if you look at Kushner's remarks, right, that's not a really proposal, right? The way he talked about it is like Palestinians screwed up everything they were ever offered, and it's going to be up to them if they screw this up as well. So his remarks were not remarks of a, negotiator or somebody who was pushing for any kind of plan about anything, right? It was a declaration. It actually reminded me of some of the imperial edicts in the Ottoman Empire. What we call negotiations today used to be done like you send an imperial edict to this small principality or whatever. They take it or leave it. otherwise you'll conquer them. That's it. It sounded a lot more like that. So that was very striking. So on the one hand, Trump administration dropped the pretense of any kind of neutrality, but at the same time, they tried to maintain the pretense that it is a plan. And I think that is to prevent Israel from being called an apartheid officially, right? This way, yes, look, there is a plan here. They could actually eventually somehow, maybe if they did all of this, could get a state, just to make sure that, you know, Israel is not considered an apartheid. I don't have a better explanation for it. Maybe you guys can offer that. So it accomplishes, I guess, Netanyahu's goals about Israel's security. They've lost, and then we are not an apartheid. They're the party who are refusing a sensible solution. And we got the funds for it. Wait, actually, we don't really have the funds for it. Somebody will pay for that $50 billion, but we'll figure that out along the way. Anyway, I'm caricaturizing, but I think these are the things that really struck me. That silver lining, perhaps, is Trump administration dropped any pretense of acting as a neutral party as the United States, finding a lasting solution to this. But at the same time, they do continue some of the pretense to protect, again, Israel's, Netanyahu's requirements, I guess, in many ways. When we tried to put together the book that Hasan talked about at the beginning, it was triggered by the Jerusalem announcement. Trump administration went ahead and said, you know, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel. Deal with it. That's it. So we put together, Mark has a chapter, Lara has a chapter. Lara was going to talk about it, hopefully today. Lara makes an important point, like take Trump seriously at his word. And he had promised this prior to the election. After the election, that's what he did. And he was going to come up with this deal of the century, and he did. So he's consistent in many ways. When it comes to Israel-Palestine issue especially, he's doing what he promised to do. He's prior to the election and afterwards. But in the book, we collected several chapters from some international authors as well, and we authored one on Turkey's activism and leadership. I think the one thing, silver lining, I guess, is it's just not accepted. It's not legitimate. It's not considered legitimate by the international community, whatever that means, right? U.S. was isolated at the UN. Islamic IOC did refuse it, that declaration about Jerusalem. We see a similar kind of thing happening, except, Mark, in that audience in front of Trump, there was the ambassador of the UAE, yes. And I believe Bahrain, if I'm not wrong.
That's correct.
Oman as well.
That's right.
But Arab League still ended up refusing the plan. So again, if you're going to be cynical about the reaction of the international community, oh, it means nothing, Trump did what he wanted, and Arabs are largely silent, they're just doing rubber stamp, I guess, on not rubber stamp, but perhaps just looking the other way by simply contenting themselves with some sort of declaration. But at the same time, nobody is now in the international community or the Arab world in a serious way working towards a solution or a plan, because there is none, like Khaled mentioned. So where does this put us going forward? To be honest, we can talk about risks. We can revert to violence. I mean, Palestinian administration authority announced they're not going to cooperate with security, Israel's security. What does that mean? What will that amount to? I don't know. Maybe Khaled would have a better, obviously, perspective on that. But there is obviously the danger that things can spiral out of control, and we may go towards another round of violence. And I don't know how that would help Palestinians at this point, or what would happen afterwards. Does this plan somehow gets traction? If it's funded, let's say, the economic development of Palestinian lands, I don't know. I'm very doubtful, cynical about that. And then just a couple words on Turkey's approach to this. Turkey tried to lead in the Jerusalem Declaration, sort of lead on refusing this, right? And Turkey has been saying Jerusalem is not just about Palestine, it's the Islamic world. Actually, just last week, President Erdogan was talking about how it's the legacy not just for Muslims, but from David, Solomon. It's the Abrahamic religion's legacy that is at stake here. You can't simply give it away to anyone like that. And Turkey has been consistent on criticism of settlements, and has been trying to support Abbas, and it also supports Hamas in Gaza as well. So what could that accomplish? It has accomplished, like I said, you can look at it cynically and say it doesn't mean much, but the international lack of legitimacy of both Jerusalem Declaration and this plan, I think, is significant in its own right. Can it change facts on the ground? Very few things, I think, has been able to change the facts on the ground, including the U.S., heavy sort of involvement, diplomatic involvement in the past to try to find a solution. It didn't work. So I don't know what would work, to be honest, but we are at an interesting place where U.S. no longer will pretend that it is trying to be a neutral arbiter of this conflict, and that international community can no longer pretend that there is a peace possibility of two-state solution that we can work towards. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Ustun. It's really beneficial to hear your comments from a different perspective, but maybe. And also, it's really interesting. Interesting to hear your analogy with between the imperial declarations in the past and the Trump administration's declaration of deal of the century. And I'll ask one question to each speaker briefly. Mr. Elgindy, you said there's a precedent for everything that Trump administration has done about Jerusalem. So the question frequently asked in this town is, why now? Why did Trump present this deal now as opposed to earlier in this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the why now has to do with the political timetables in Israel and in the United States. As you all know, we have an election coming up in November, and the Israelis have an election coming up every few months. They have an election in March, their third, and it may very well go to a fourth. And even though the Trump administration, obviously they are hoping to have a second term, it's not a guarantee. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is indicted now on a number of criminal charges, and his future is unknown. And so I think there was a feeling that there is a narrow window of opportunity that's why, in their view, this is the deal of the century. This is designed to consolidate a century's worth of policies and practices by the Zionist movement and by Israel over the whole of what they consider Eretz Israel, of Greater Israel. So in their view, this is the right moment, because a year from now, they may not be in office. Netanyahu's future is uncertain. And so there is this narrow window between now and November that it all had to happen, because they are burning the bridge back to a two-state solution. So they're not only, blowing it up, but they're ensuring that no one can rebuild it. This is a scorched earth policy that is designed that even if they lose in November and you have a Democratic administration, that all of this will be irreversible. And some of it will be. I'm not sure how much of it will be, but that is the aim, I think.
Thank you for your answer. So basically, both leaders, they are doing favor each other. So I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Perry about this, doing favor each other. Is it really common between Israeli and the United States relationship? Leaders, candidates, they do some favor each other. What would you say?
This has been a long process between the United States and Israel. We were despite Harry Truman's decision in the late 1940s to recognize Israel, the United States was never that tied to Israel in the 1950s and 1960s. And we kind of viewed them as, kind of Eastern European socialists. Some of them were members of the Communist Party. And Israeli leaders, were viewed the United States with some skepticism, but over the years, the relationship grew. Mm-hmm. And I think that the Kushner Plan is kind of the culmination of the direction in which it grew, which is that, Israel had to re-anchor itself, which it did in the early 2000s, had to re-anchor itself in the United States. I remember being in meetings at think tanks like 2001, 2002, after 9/11, 2002, 2003, where Israeli officials would come and they very purposely cultivated their standing inside the evangelical Christian community. And I remember asking some of these Israeli officials, what are you doing? And I got the sense that the Israelis believe that Jewish Americans, because of their progressive values, were going to be at some point in the future an inconstant partner of Israel and kind of a critic of what Israel was doing. There were already tendencies inside the American Jewish community, very strong tendencies, to talk to Israelis about their treatment of the Palestinians, and this made Israelis uncomfortable. And you didn't have to have those kinds of conversations in the Baptist Church in Birmingham or at Liberty University. Because Israel was the expression of Christian belief in what would ultimately be, despite its minority position inside Christian evangelical, it was, Israel was the leading edge of the rapture. This really took root. So I think that I see, and maybe I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but I think we see in the Kushner Plan the kind of Trump administration is solidifying its place inside the evangelical Christian community. Not that it needed to do so, but kind of confirmed its deep roots inside the evangelical community by using Israel as kind of the ground truth of what it was going to do in the Middle East, and at the same time issuing warnings to the American Jewish community that if they were going to be seen as true patriots, they had better support Israel. So, there's the trade-offs have always been there, but the trade-offs aren't going to be there in the future. This is I don't. It's not the end of history, but it might be the end of. I just can't see Aaron David Miller going back and sitting down between Israelis and Palestinians and saying, "Hey, listen, we're not Israel's lawyer." Yeah, we are. The peace process is over, and what comes next is anyone's guess. I'm just going to answer a question you didn't ask because it's occurred to me. So what happens? I don't know what happens, but I can tell you this, and I'm going to do my boomer thing. You're all going to roll your eyes, but here it is. Back when I was 15 years old, there's a Look magazine. It was a big pictorial magazine, oversized. I love Look magazine. I was 15 years old, and I looked at Look magazine, and they had a photo spread of American military power in Vietnam, and there was a double-page spread of our base at Cam Ranh Bay, and I looked at it and I thought, holy guys, we can't lose. We lost. And then I looked at the Berlin Wall in the 1970s and 80s, and I thought, this thing is never going to come down. It came down in 24 hours. And you look at South Africa and you thought, apartheid is here to stay. And it was gone in a year. I don't know what's going to happen. But I can tell you this, that what we think is permanent on Monday is not there on Tuesday. Often, very often. And the status quo in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel is not there to stay. How it changes, I don't know. And whether we have anything to do with it, I doubt it. But this is untenable. That's not going to last.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Ustun about the making of this deal. We remember that Mr. Kushner, he went to many countries, including Turkey, and President Trump has talked to President Erdogan. Do you think there's a sufficient discussion, for example, take the case of Turkey, do you think there's a sufficient discussion about this peace deal between Turkey and the United States?
I think what happened is what Kushner planned, Kushner's attitude that I described earlier, I think has been there all along. He had a vision. It was about economic development. How he understood facts on the ground was basically Israeli occupation being accepted and then Israel's security being prioritized. And I think he did come to Turkey briefly, but I don't imagine that there was any serious negotiation. It was more about, okay, this is what we are planning to do. And Erdogan and Trump has a good relationship overall, let's say. There's been a lot of pressure from Congress on Turkey about sanctions, and we'll see how that plays out in, I believe, April. But Trump has kind of has been talking to Erdogan. He's actually been one of the biggest advocates of Turkey in town in many ways when there aren't many advocates of Turkey. But despite that, right? Despite that, Erdogan is very vocal and consistent about his opposition to Jerusalem Declaration, opposition to this deal. It's not, he even went as far as saying, if we lose Jerusalem today, we'll lose Kaaba tomorrow, like Mecca. So it's like he sees it as part of, standing up for the Islamic world's values and sort of holy places. I don't think it's a negotiable thing for him. Perhaps Kushner understood that anyway. But it is going to be one of the things that Turkey and US will strongly disagree, and I don't see any chance of cooperation on that. Turkey will continue to support the Palestinians as much as it can diplomatically. There's some financial help as well. But this lack of security cooperation going forward, like what is going to happen instead of that? That's if the Palestinians are not going to cooperate with Israel, what happens there? And if there is a flare-up in violence, what happens then? I think you're going to, I mean, you can be sure of Turkish vocal reaction. When nobody was protesting like settlements, like 200 houses here, 50 houses there, you'll see, go back, I mean, because of that chapter, I found out at every instance, Turkish Foreign Ministry keeps condemning it, and Erdogan will talk about it as well. So Palestinian issue has a special place for the Turkish public. Just opposition parties actually last week united, and they did a rally against this plan. So I don't think there's much room for bypassing Palestinians and talking to Turkey about Palestine. I think Turkey will follow what the Palestinian leadership can come up with, and it will try to rally the Islamic world against these kind of plans and declarations.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll make a quick round of questions, and I'd like to ask you, Mr. Elgindy, about the bipartisan support for Israel in Capitol Hill. Do you think will Israel lose this bipartisan support? Do you think how do you think it will be affected?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no question that the American political landscape is shifting on this issue, and Mark talked about it. We see it certainly in the American Jewish community, which is typically votes Democratic overwhelmingly and tends to be on the liberal end of the ideological spectrum. And what's interesting about that is, this is sort of my setup for how I'm going to answer the question, is what's interesting is, there have always been connections between American politics and Israeli politics. And in fact, there's been American politics and policy on this issue has been pegged in a lot of ways to Israeli politics. But what's happened, and so you have, for example, in the 90s, Republicans were skeptical of the Oslo process in the same way that the Likud party was skeptical, and Labor was pro-Oslo in the same way that Democrats were. So there were they were sort of in sync. Now we don't have that. Now we have Israeli politics has consistently shifted more and more to the right, and what that has done is it has left American Jews, for the most part, as Mark said, without a counterpart in Israel. There is no liberal left in Israel. It doesn't exist except in the form of the Joint List, which, of course, is a predominantly Palestinian made up of mainly Palestinian members, and it's marginal in Israeli politics, even though it's the third largest bloc in the Knesset. And so American Jews don't have a counterpart in Israeli politics, and the Democrats no longer have a counterpart. Republicans are in lockstep with the right wing in Israel, even as it slides more and more to the right. Many Democrats are also in lockstep, but it's becoming harder and harder to sustain. And so that is creating a rupture, not only between the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, but within the Democratic Party. There is now this open schism. When you have 100 members, Democratic members of Congress, sending a letter rejecting the Trump plan, that's very significant. When you have presidential candidates across the spectrum on the Democratic side rejecting the plan. And by doing so, they are opposing the pro-Israel establishment. The pro-Israel establishment, groups like the ADL and AIPAC, are either on board with the Trump plan, or they're vague enough to sort of fudge the issue. They promote immediate return to negotiations. So they couch it in language that isn't condemning the plan. And I think if you're not actively condemning this plan as a farce, then you are giving it aid and succor. And it is tantamount, I think, to an endorsement, because it's very clearly, its intention is very, very clear. So there is that there is that growing chasm inside the Democratic Party and between the two parties, and I believe that it's irreversible because the mission of a group like AIPAC, for example, is to support and to encourage members of Congress and other politicians to support Israeli policies no matter what, to ensure uncritical and unconditional support for Israel. That is their mission. And when you've got Democrats who are reluctant, they are going against the pro-Israel establishment. And so we are headed, I think, for a showdown inside the Democratic Party over this issue.
Thank you. Mr. Perry, would you like to comment on the bipartisan support?
There is no bipartisan support. I argued during the last re-election cycle, I mean, I'm not that influential. No one, I mean, you know, my phone doesn't ring and it's Bernie Sanders on the other end. But, you know, I argued to a number of campaigns the last, how many? Well, there were only 3 campaigns, but I argued to each of the campaigns last time that there was more room here to criticize Israel and more of a deeply rooted skepticism about Israel than many Democrats believed. That you were not going to automatically lose votes if you criticized Israel, if you were a candidate. I would make the same argument now to somebody like Amy Klobuchar, who seems to be just absolutely over the moon about Israel, and argue to her that her kind of instincts, progressive instincts, should override that. She's not going to lose. I just don't think that there's a loss of votes here. As a historian, I look for handholds in American history. I mean, if you weren't anti-abolitionist in the 1820s and 1830s in America, you know, you were out of your mind because the vast majority of the American public was anti-abolitionist. By 1859, that had transformed totally. So the abolitionist movement could elect a railroad lawyer from Illinois to represent them, and he, you know, and that would have been unheard of just 10 years previously. And so I think that the Democratic Party is on the kind of, if history is a guide, and it isn't always, but the Democratic Party is now being pro-Israel means being pro-evangelical in many parts of the Democratic Party. And they're just progressive Jews in this country who are not going to do that. And so I think that, you know, I think that my colleague is absolutely right. This is a transformative time, and the kind of institutional pressures that we've seen before are no longer in place.
I'll ask you a final question about Secretary Pompeo. Remember last time you were here, we discussed Pompeo's role in Soleimani strikes in detail. So is Secretary Pompeo involved in these negotiations at all, or is this an initiative independent of the State Department and or normal channels of the negotiations? How do you see the role of Pompeo?
Mr. Pompeo has a Bible on his desk that is open to whatever, Ezra chapter, I don't know. But he's a 1986 graduate of West Point, and he's a born-again Christian. And he strongly supports Israel, always has strongly supported Israel. Did you all see, by the way, Alan Dershowitz kind of pat him on the back during the rollout of the Kushner plan? It was unbelievable. And Kushner was questioned about it on CNN. Alan Dershowitz patted Pompeo on the back during the rollout of the Kushner plan, and Dershowitz was questioned about it on CNN, and he said, listen, I believe in peace in the Middle East. I believe in peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and his views on Israel comport with mine. I thought, you don't believe in peace in the Middle East, you believe in Israel. Greater Israel. I really want to get this comment in, so this is another instance of my answering a question that hasn't been asked. But Hannah Arendt, I keep coming back to her writings. Zionism Revisited, 1944. But later in life, she talked about a meeting she had with Golda Meir in Israel, in which she had a long interview with her, and Hannah Arendt talked about her Jewish values, what it means to be Jewish, and deep belief in God, and Judaism, the first monotheistic religion. And Golda Meir said, "Oh, I don't believe in God." And Hannah Arendt looked at her and said, "What?" Said, "Oh, I don't believe. I'm a socialist. I don't believe in God." And Hannah Arendt said, "That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing." I play around with this idea, and I haven't pinned it down, so I apologize. It's kind of half-formed, which isn't fair. But in the Jewish community, and especially in Israel, there are many, many people who don't go to the synagogue. And there are many American Jews who don't go to the synagogue. I'm not accusing them of being atheists, but Israel has become kind of a stand-in for American Jewish belief in the future and the hope for their people. It's because of the Holocaust. It's undeniably historic, tragedy. And I think what we're going to see in the future is that the American Jewish community is going to kind of reclaim its values as progressive, monotheistic. And Israel's going to go the other way. It is a racially based society. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. We should
Thank you, Mr. Perry.
take questions.
Shall we take the questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get to the audience here, please. Yeah, we need a microphone, please. Wait for the microphone.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. We have two national capitals in Rome. We can have two national capitals in Jerusalem. Folks got to lighten up on that, okay? We could still have East Jerusalem as a capital of the new Palestinian state and put our embassy somewhere in Jerusalem. That's just fine. You got to lighten up on that. Second of all, you have Jewish Semites oppressing Muslim Semites. That's not racism, okay? You just stop using that term. More importantly, this thing is a train wreck. It was stillborn before it was born. It's not going anywhere. It's identical to the purchase of Greenland. Why are we worrying about this? No one's going to talk about this by December. Okay?
Well, you're here.
Good question. So,
why are we worried about this?
All right, thank you for the question. Now, Mr. Perry, would you like to, or Mr. Elgindy?
Why did we put this event together? Maybe that's your question. I mean, yes, when you look at the sort of, I think for a lot of Muslims, I think that's Turkey's position too. The declarations today, annexation, occupation, you drive out Palestinians, you subjugate them, etc., won't get you, it won't result in terms of history, when you look at long durée of history, it won't get you there. Even if there's no Palestinians left in that land, I mean, this might sound really weird, but like, I don't think Islamic world will give up on it. So that's the point. That's the approach Turkey takes. You're saying East Jerusalem, I mean, in the plan, it doesn't give East Jerusalem to Palestinians, first of all.
The plan's a train wreck. It's done. It's over.
Yes, but here what we're trying to discuss is what happens now, right? Going forward, there is this declaration, but I mean, it's now official U.S. policy. You like it or not. If he gets reelected, Trump, this is going to be another 4 years, and that's his idea of peace for this part of the world, for this region. And it is the biggest sponsor of Israel. It's not like you can extricate Israel out of the regional dynamics. When you're discussing Iran, Iraq, Syria, everything in the region, it will have some sort of Israeli dimension, and the U.S. is willing to weigh in on this part of Israel, and that will determine regional dynamics. You can't just say, this is just a declaration, it's useless, and it just shows, once again, in my mind, that how the U.S., when you're looking at U.S. policy in the Middle East, that's one thing you really need to pay attention to, what's going on in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. In that sense, I think it is important. And as I said, it doesn't give East Jerusalem to Palestinians at all. It just, what is that tiny town or, anyway.
It talks about Abu Dis
Abu
and
Dis.
Shafat and Kufr Aqab as capitals for Palestine. And they're outside of the wall, notably, and then, of course, not in Jerusalem.
So, I mean, it also destroys the aspiration to have Jerusalem as an international sort of, city, special city for all the religions. It actually, gives it to one religion in that way, sowing the seeds of, further, I guess, violence and potential conflict. I don't know why you're saying we shouldn't call it racism when, I mean, I'll leave it to Khaled. I mean, I'll leave you the easy question, Khaled. And I don't see it as purchase of Greenland. I don't think it's that simple. Even Greenland didn't want to sell, right? So.
Yes, Mr. Yellen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons why it's important, why we're here, and why I would presume that you're here. I mean, first of all, we're talking about two very powerful actors. The United States is the most powerful nation in the world, and so what it says and does resonates, has meaning, has importance. Israel is the counterpart to the United States in the Middle East. It is a regional superpower. It's a nuclear power. It is by far the most powerful nation in the region. And so when you have these two powerful entities trying to impose a reality, I'm not talking about a reality on the ground. That reality on the ground exists. But they're trying to impose a political and legal reality that didn't already exist. There's a real threat that it can take hold. So power matters. So power is one reason. Another reason is that Trump could very well be reelected, and we would have another 4 years in which this reality would be consolidated on the ground. And the third reason is history. Historically, when just looking at the history of this conflict, and I wrote a book on this subject that looks at the entire history going back 100 years for this very reason, because I wanted to see what the historical precedents are for what is happening. And if you go back to 1947 and 1948, the international consensus was Resolution 181, the partition resolution, and 194. Those were the terms of reference of the peace process, one dealing with borders and Jerusalem, and the other dealing with refugees. That was the peace process. Now, what happened was that the United States, the Israelis, and most of the Western world ignored those terms of reference of that peace process on refugees, Jerusalem, and borders, and acquiesced in realities on the ground. Israel was established on the basis of the UN partition borders of 1947 in 56% of the mandate of Palestine. It now exists, well, not 100%, but in terms of its accepted legitimacy on 78%. So there are realities on the ground that people tend to acquiesce in because they can't reverse them. And that is the fear that the international community is there's fatigue on this issue. They're tired they want to make the issue go away. They can't be on the record as supporting this plan, but that doesn't mean it's going to disappear. If Trump has another 4 years and Israel starts implementing this on the ground, it's it's not far-fetched to imagine that the world and the region will acquiesce in that new reality. And that is precisely what Netanyahu is banking on, and that Kushner is banking on. They would have liked to get an endorsement from the Arab League, but I don't think they expected it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I think as long as the world acquiesces in it, they don't resist it head on, then their plan will have succeeded. And I had one last point related to that is, now imagine even if Trump isn't reelected and you have a Democratic president in the White House, it's very hard to imagine also the fact that the entire Israeli political spectrum, left, well, there isn't the left, but center right and hard right and extreme right, have all rallied around this plan. Gantz, who is the presumed opposition figure in Israel, he's okay with this plan. He would like to do it in coordination and some sort of patina of a diplomatic process rather than going full on unilateral, but they're all on board. It's hard to imagine, if you have a new administration in Washington, how that administration will convince any future Israeli leader to accept anything less than what is in that plan. And so this is the new normal. This is the new norm, which is precisely what the plan is trying to do. It's not trying to change reality on the ground. It is trying to consecrate reality on the ground as the final solution, as the permanent solution, by getting rid of the rules of the game to begin with. And there's a very real risk that they could do that by virtue of power.
Thank you very much for the answer. Is there any other question? Yes, sir.
Joseph Sala from the ANN Group, and I'd like to follow up on something that Khaled just spoke to. The votes in the League and the OIC were easy gets, if you will, against the plan. Why is Abbas not trying to force this in the Security Council, where he would put the P5 in a position that they would have to make a declaration on this as an issue?
Right. You tried just this week. He's been trying to push that in the Security Council in order to get the 4 other permanent members to agree on language that would condemn the Trump plan and therefore isolate the Trump administration. The Trump administration, of course, would have none of it, and they floated their own texts that the UK, the Germans, and the French all sort of jumped on and said, here's an opportunity to avoid a confrontation with the United States. Again, it's a question of power. It's not a question of principle. The Europeans are very, very squarely in favor of Resolution 242, of land for peace, of a two-state solution, of genuine Palestinian statehood with sovereignty, and they're against this plan. They've said it. They've said this plan contradicts the basic rules of international law and the goal of a two-state solution. But power matters. They don't want to poke the tiger in the eye. And so, Mahmoud Abbas actually, given his otherwise very, very weak position, almost got to get the other Security Council members to condemn the United States. I don't think he will succeed at it, but that was a pretty tall order to begin with. So as far as I know, he is trying to do precisely what you laid out.
Thank you for the answer. Would you like to add anything, Mr. Mayor? No? Any other questions? Do we have any other questions? If there's no question, I'd like to ask the final and the hard one, the most difficult one. What should a great deal look like? I mean, how does a great deal look like? How would you answer this question in 5 minutes? Mr. Perry, would you like to go first?
One state. One state.
Yeah,
One state.
one state. Yeah.
One state.
Where Jews and Palestinians live and work together, and one state, and that's what's going to happen. I'm sorry. I don't have much to say about this, and then I go on for half an hour. But if a future prime minister of Israel, or a person who wants to be prime minister of Israel, decides that the only way to become prime minister of Israel is to harvest the Arab votes in the Knesset, that changes things, I think. That makes politics in Israel real in a way that it hasn't been real. And I think that we're coming to that. Israeli democracy has proven itself to be unworkable in many ways. Well, I'm not saying it's not a democracy, it is, but it's a confessional democracy in which there's only one confession that counts. In the future, if that's not true, it changes things, I think, significantly, and it kind of opens the door to what Israel might be in the future. And I keep looking for that to happen. I keep kind of saying, come on, Benny, you can become prime minister. All you have to do is make the Palestinians visible. Not a state, just visible.
Thank you. Mr. Ustun. Or
I mean, my view is I think theoretically we know the general outlines of what a two-state solution could look like and should look like. Two capitals, a genuine Palestinian sovereignty, a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with some mutually agreed minimal territorial modifications. The formulas are there, but there has never been an Israeli government that has had the incentive to do that. Why would you share the pie when you could just have it all to yourself? And when the person who is supposed to be compelling you to share is sort of acquiescing in your eating the pie as you go. So you don't really have an incentive. And so that brings us to the reality that we're at, where we may very well, I think this plan could actually be the formal death knell to a two-state solution. But that doesn't mean that a one-state solution based on equal citizenship rights suddenly becomes viable. I think we're in that sort of limbo where two states isn't doable, if only because neither the United States nor Israel want it. And I'm not sure that the Democrats who do want it bad enough that they're willing to pay a political price for it. And so that's probably finished. But a one state hasn't become politically viable for reasons that not only have to do with Israeli politics and demographics, but also on the Palestinian side. I don't see a Palestinian political movement that is credible, that is rallying around a one state solution. Right. In fact, even Hamas has sort of informally and unofficially entered the two state camp on a de facto basis. And is part of that Palestinian political consensus in favor of a state in all of the West Bank and Gaza. So, until we see a movement emerge that will rally both Palestinians and Israelis, then we're stuck in this reality where there is neither a two-state solution nor a one-state solution. And instead, we're living in what looks more and more like an apartheid reality, a formal apartheid reality on the ground.
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really well said. I just wanted to point out something also Mark said, visible, invisible things. So it's Palestinians haven't been considered a subject for a long time. They haven't been an actor in their own right, recognized, legitimate, with legitimate demands. And that trend has been just going downwards. Where did that really become a reality? I can't tell exactly. Maybe once they accepted to cooperate with Israeli security, maybe for some people that's the point that they gave up on a lot of things. There are many turning points you can point to, but ultimately right now it's not a matter of, like Khalid said, it's not a matter of reasonable plans existing or not. It is the power issue that Khalid mentioned. The Palestinians don't have that kind of power to be recognized as a legitimate actor, as a subject who deserve to determine their own future and their rights, define the rights and what they want on their own. And that can't happen with an imposition from outside. That can be supported if the Arab world and Islamic world were actually united and they were willing to pay the political price on this. And that's also diminishing, I think. A lot of Gulf powers and some others are willing to go along with what Trump administration is saying. So as Khalid said, like until we get Palestinian subjecthood recognized in its own right, and then Israeli side actually, the politics around this changes, it won't matter what kind of plan you offer. Ultimately, you won't get a just and equitable solution, which then won't last. Like whatever solution you come up with, it will in the long run just like the Berlin Wall, I guess. Mark. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the last remarks. So I'd like to conclude this panel. Join me in thanking the panelists here. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job.
Thank you.